Welcome back to American Christian or Christian American. I'm Sean Legacy. I am your host. If you would hit that subscribe button, you can get the videos more often, also notification bell. Today we're going to be talking about, up till now we've talked about the history of people and how the people of God who were created were medium brown skin, and then there were differences within the skin tones. They became darker and they became a little lighter. But everybody up until the time of the flood was of African descent, was what we consider black or brown people today. And Caucasians didn't come along until after the Tower of Babel, because that's when people would have spread out. Now, if you haven't seen the videos before, I strongly urge you to get and look at those videos so that way you can get a context to what we're talking about. But just a brief looking back, we talked about how scientifically and otherwise that medium brown people were the only people that could produce the wide varieties of skin tones that we have today. It's because they have the genetics that represent all the people in the world. If you get somebody who is on the darker side of the spectrum, and they marry somebody who is also on the darker side of the spectrum, all they will produce is children who are very, very dark. If you get somebody on the lightest end of the spectrum, that's all they're going to produce is very light-skinned people. And any variations in there, like a person who is Caucasian but has a strong ability to tan, those two people would create variations within that particular spectrum. And the same thing goes on the darker end of the spectrum, that if you got somebody who was not as dark, there would be some variations. However, eumelanin has a dominance, and so it would still lean towards the darker area. But if you have a family of a medium brown people, and if you look at their children, they can produce darker children and lighter children. So this is the only group of people, because you could not take Caucasian people and produce light-skinned people, darker-skinned people. That's impossible genetically. We lose the ability to protect ourselves with the sun through eumelanin, but we don't gain it. So it had to be people, you can gain it when people have the ability, like medium brown people can produce all ends of the spectrum. But once you don't have it, you can't get it unless you marry somebody who has that ability. So it is impossible for white people to be the first people. And we went through that and talked about it, talked about the history, how Shem and Ham were darker, Ham being probably the darkest, Japheth being the lightest, although still brown skin. In fact, this is brown skin, really. It's just a very, very light level of brown skin. It's like if you look at beige when you're going to paint something. We're not white. Caucasians are not white. There's a very light level of eumelanin within our skin. When I say the word eumelanin, remember we talked about melanin? And melanin is a key word for different types of melanin. Eumelanin means the one that produces the darker skin tones, or depending on how much eumelanin is present. And phenomelanin, which is the type that produces the redness in the lips, the nipples, and otherwise. Also can be a combination of phenomelanin and eumelanin that produces red hair. So that's just a little bit of a recap. Now, we've worked our way up to Jesus. We've proved again that Shem and the descendant of Shem was Abraham, then Abraham. There were other descendants as well. But we come down to the tribes of Israel, to David, and all through that history we see again and again that the people of Israel were intermingling, meaning by marrying into the Canaanites and sometimes the Egyptians. These were all black people at that time. Now, it's been lied about and everything else about it to say that they were white, because they don't want to give credit to the Egyptians for all the different great scientific discoveries that they made. But the fact is they were black people. Later on, that changed because of invasions, because of other reasons. But it didn't start out that way. And the Canaanites were dark-skinned people. Did it stay that way? No, they lightened up because of different invasions and people taking over, like the Greeks, the Romans, and otherwise. Christ was a brown-skinned man. He had hair like wool, like an African. Now we said that when we talked about that if that was the only thing that we had, talking about in Revelation and Daniel, that maybe it would be figurative. But it's just another piece of the puzzle, that everything comes together to show the black presence in the Bible. There is no white presence in the Bible. There is nothing in the beginning that shows anything about being white. We only believe that because we've been told that, because we've been lied to about it. We were lied to about the fact that saying Ham was cursed when he saw Noah's nakedness, his father. But it wasn't Ham that was cursed in the first place. It was his son Canaan, Noah's grandson. And there is no talk about a pigmentation change. So all these things have been put in there in order to make one group of people look more special. And so we believe these lies. We believe all the evidences that are pointed out because they point out the evidences of people who, after they were lighter-skinned people. The fact is that Caucasian people only represent 15% of the world, and brown-eyed people represent 70 to 80%. Let's just say 75 for in-between sake. So eumelanin in the eyes and eumelanin in people's skin tones is much more prevalent than that 15% of Caucasians. You think that Caucasian people would be able to produce all that? Even though they scientifically can't produce any of that. So where did all these dark-skinned people come from? Did they just come from the people of Kush? The only people that haven't been discredited. So all this is ridiculous. Well, now Christ has come, Christ has died, and then we look what happens after there. We're going to look at the establishment of the elders of the church, and we're going to look at the different things that happened. But first I want to back up just a little bit and talk about the nature of Israel. Israel was created as a theocracy. Now, for those of you who don't know, theocracy comes with the word theo in it. And theo is the word for God. So in other words, we have democracy and other things like that. Theocracy is a nation that is directly governed by God himself. Who would that qualify to be? That would be Israel. Now, later on, Israel asked to have a king. So that was going away from the theocracy, but still, God was still in charge because he had the prophets who would tell the king when they were off, like David when he sinned with Bathsheba. So it was still more directly controlled by God. Now, in this sense, we could say to some degree that it was nationalism. Now, I say that because I want to establish a comparison. When the church was established, it wasn't established as a theocracy. Well, it was in a sense that the church itself was directed by God, but it wasn't connected to government. The church was meant to be in all countries, in all places of the world, and to be separate from the country's leadership. That doesn't mean that we don't teach all the people in the government. We may convert them. But the church was not meant to actually run the government like it was in a theocracy under Israel. But this is exactly what we are having a problem with today. And I'm going to point out that it didn't start today. It started after the establishment of the church. It started about 300 years after Christ, the birth of Christ, around 280 AD, with the birth of Constantine the emperor. Now, first of all, Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. There was some battles going on for a few years, but they were wiped out. Now, what is the significance of that? Israel, or Judah, or the Jewish people, were preserved through God for a particular purpose. What was that purpose? To preserve the original people, down from Seth, down to Noah, down to Abraham, down to David, and down to Joseph and Mary, and then to Jesus. It was important because the promise of the Christ would come through David. All right? That's what the genealogies were there for. Now, Jerusalem's destroyed, and the genealogies are all wiped out. So in the future, people would know who came from who. Why would they need to now as much? Because Jesus had been produced. The Christ had come about. So it was no longer necessary for that to exist. And the Jews were no longer God's chosen people. The chosen people of God now are those who are within the church. Now, the Jews all had the opportunity to go to the church, but many of them rejected the church. Why? A part of it was a way of thinking with the Jews. The Jews were not anticipating Christ to come as he was. They were anticipating a military leader who would help Israel or Judah reconquer and establish itself as a strong kingdom. They were also expecting a spiritual leader. So they weren't really expecting one person, even though the Bible talked about it. That was not what they were expecting. So they rejected the idea of Christ because he was moving beyond the physical kingdom and into the spiritual kingdom. We were meant to mature into a higher level of thinking. We were no longer going to have physical battles. It wasn't our job to divide and conquer physically anymore, and because we didn't have God's direction for that. Our direction was to teach people within all nations and give them an opportunity to accept God's plan, his loving message to them. So we're going to look at some more evidences today and talk about these things in history. I'll be with you in just a moment. We'll look here at some different documentations. Okay, we're going to start here in Acts chapter 14 and verse 23. We're going to make a point. We're going to talk a little bit about things about the church in order for us to go ahead and deal with some areas where problems begin to happen. Acts chapter 14, verse 23, we're talking about Paul and Barnabas appointing elders for them in each church and praying with prayer and fasting, committed them to the Lord in whom they put their trust. So each individual church, they appointed elders, were part of the leadership. We're going to look at another area that talks about elders and deacons. But deacons, the word deacon is another word for servant. They might carry on a particular ministry or different things, a particular task that they became the head of. Stephen, who was the first Christian martyr, was a deacon, but he was assigned a particular ministry, but he also preached the gospel, in which ended up in him being killed for the Lord. So now we know they've been appointed in each and every church. And now we're going to go on to 1 Timothy chapter 3, and it talks about the qualifications for an elder. But we're going to look at several different translations because there are different words that are used for the office or the position of an elder. And we get confused on those words, and sometimes they're used for other things, but they were all talking about this particular office. So in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1, from the easy-to-read translation, which was a translation established for people who have a harder time with English, who would be newer to the country, or for deaf and hard of hearing people who English is not their first language, if they use American Sign Language, which is completely different. I have a history of American Sign Language. It's my second language. Verse 1 says, it is a true statement that anyone whose goal is it to serve as an elder has his heart set on a good work. An elder must be a good man that no one can rightly criticize him. He must be faithful to his wife. He must have self-control and be wise. Now we're going to read more of this text after we go through a few different translations. I'm just trying to point out where it uses the term elder, which is consistent with Acts chapter 14. But it doesn't necessarily have to use the same word for the position. There were different translations who chose different words to mean the same office. Let's go down, let's go to the American Standard Version, which it says here, faithfully is the saying, if a man seeketh the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. The bishop therefore must be without reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, orderly, given to hospitality, ability to teach. Okay, again, we've got the same office with a different translation using a different word, bishop. So a bishop, if we understand bishop, is supposed to be in the local church. That's what Barnabas and Saul were appointing these bishops to be in the particular local churches. They were not meant to be part of a hierarchy of governing over many churches. They were for the local church only. Let's look again. we're going to look at the King James Version. This is a true saying. If a man desires the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. Again, the word bishop. Now we're going to go to the New International Version, which is a modern translation. Well, let's look at the New American Standard, just to see this one here. Okay, the New American Standard here says, if a man desires the office of an overseer. All right, excuse me. So now we're seeing the word overseer. And we're going to go down to, I passed it, New International Version. Here is a trustworthy saying, whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-control, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he care for God's church? And down below it talks about the instructions, or also in the same way manner, deacons. We're not going to get into deacons so much. They were servants, but we're talking about the elders, overseers, or bishops. Okay, now we're talking about Constantine. Constantine was a Roman emperor, and you may have heard of him before, may not have. He was born February 27th in 280, his AD actually. He died around 337. He was known for befriending the church. Well, up until this time, the church had been persecuted, and many times brutally. You've heard the stories of Christians being thrown in the lion's den, everything else. The church was under persecution, but actually it made the church strong. The befriending of the church by Constantine maybe did some good things, but really in many ways it wasn't good, because Constantine had other things in mind. He claimed to be a Christian, but he was actually interested in the power of the church. He saw the magnitude of the convictions of these people within the church. And so he began to direct and control things. And this would lead to it would become a merger between the Roman Empire and the Christian church. The problem with this is it developed into something completely different, rather than what the church was supposed to be. If we look here, we're looking at some information on the First Council of Nicene, how it shaped early Christianity. It was conveyed in 325 AD, so actually not too far off of Nero's death. It was a pivotal moment in Christianity. It was the first council aimed at addressing critical theological disputes and establishing uniform doctrine among Christians. Okay, another document on Council of Nicene. The First Council of Nicene, the Council of Christian Bishops. So what happened here is that bishops from different churches were brought together into this council, which evolved into the bishops of Catholicism. Now, Catholicism is not what God wanted, but it is what evolved. Now, after the bishops, we also have the idea of the Pope came along. Well, the Catholics would claim that the first Pope was Peter. And they'll go on this verse, which I'm going to read here. I don't have it up on the screen. But it's from Matthew chapter 16, starting verse 13. When Jesus came to a region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is, meaning himself? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Christ meaning Messiah. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now here's where this is taken out of context, and without really understanding Scripture, people could misconstrue this. Now, people would have never gotten a pope out of this if it hadn't been told to them. But Peter, the Greek word for it means pebble. But on this rock, the different Greek word is used is like a huge boulder or a whole rock face. So there's a difference. It isn't upon Peter that the church is being built upon, but it's upon the confession that he made. And he would, when giving the keys to the kingdom, doesn't mean that it gives a person the ability to change things. It means that because they're preaching the word of God, that will open up the kingdom to people. And so by him teaching, everything will be saved in heaven. This has nothing to do with an extra ability for a particular person to make decisions. Let me give you an example. Years ago, it must be, 35 to 37 years ago. I don't remember exactly how old I was. I was in my 20s. But I'm from Minnesota, and the church I was attending there decided to go on television in the audience of a Catholic Jesuit named Malachi Martin. Now, the show was called Twin City Live for Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities. It doesn't exist anymore, and you can't really find it on the internet. But anyway, I was a young man, and while I had a good point, I was a little cocky in how I presented it. But the idea, this Catholic Jesuit was talking about other ideas. And I brought up the idea that the Christ is the head of the church. And if Christ is the head of the church, how can you justify a pope? You can't. What human body has two heads? It doesn't make any sense because the Bible uses an example of the body. And he laughed. And then he responded by saying, the narrator said, why can't he have some, why isn't he right or whatever? I don't remember exactly what he said, but here's the point. He said, that's because he considers the Bible as the ultimate source of authority. We do not. Ultimately, we listen to the voice of Peter, meaning the Pope. Now understand this. What they're saying is that they can do anything they want because the Pope can contradict the Bible. That goes completely against who God is. God is not a changing God. God is forever the same. The Bible tells us what we need to do. But this gave them the ability. Now they say it's only when he sits in a special chair. But we've had, if you look in history, one pope will contradict another pope. This sounds like human creation, not godly creation. What happened with this as things moved along, the Catholic Church became the first form of Christian nationalism, meaning that the church would run the government and control things. And we have that problem today, and claiming to be right, but it's not. They did untold cruel things through Catholicism, through the authority of the church. They would force people to be converted. That's more like a military action than a godly action. In the New Testament, you read again and again where people were taught the Word of God and they would accept it or they would not accept it, and people moved on. It was God would judge them upon their actions, not us. But this was used as a military, the church was being dragged along as a military excuse. In other words, they quoted Christian beliefs, but they were actually after humanistic power. The next episode, we're going to break down more of the changes that the Catholic Church made to the Bible. When we're going to move on to a little later in history and talk about the Moors, and I'll explain that, and then come back to the actions of Catholicism that led to where we are today. So think about these things. And we'll be back on American Christian or Christian American. Be blessed.